You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. According to the government's Department of Health, there were approximately 800 more suicides among men and 155 more among women between 2008 and 2010. This number was higher than expected based on their historical trends. The report Preventing Suicide in England 1 year on said a rise in poor health status associated with the recession had also been found not only for those unemployed, but also among people who had jobs. Suicide continues to be more than 3 times as common in males compared to females, and 1 in 4 people are said to suffer from some sort of mental health problem. Mixed anxiety and depression is the most common mental disorder in Britain. Depression affects 1 in 5 older people. But does talking about suicide help society deal with mental illness? Taking part in today's discussion on men and mental health is Tim Roberts, who's joining us on Skype. Tim is a current patient within the mental health system. He has experienced chronic depression for 20 years and is currently receiving therapy on the NHS. I'm also joined in the studio by Tim Lott, a novelist who has written extensively about his experiences of depression and a nervous breakdown. He's written several books, including The Scent of Dried Roses in 1996, which looks at his family history of depression. We're also joined by Michael Dunn, a psychotherapist who's worked as a psychotherapist in private practice with lots of clients for over 10 years, and during that time he's also worked with groups in the NHS and for charities. So really the discussion is about depression and mental health in men. First of all, Tim Roberts, I'd like to ask you really. You said you've experienced chronic depression for 20 years and you've been institutionalised. Could you tell us about your experience of living with depression?
Yeah, well, I was first diagnosed about 20 years ago. I had really had problems, I think, since my teenage years, but never quite had, we never really quite had the nerve to go and sort it out or go and speak to somebody. But it got to a really bad place. And as I say, about 20 years ago, I went to a doctor. I went through a course of cognitive behavioural therapy, and I didn't really think that I was getting the help that I needed. It's almost like I had to bang doors down to speak with somebody. I was put on a course of tablets. The CBT come to an end, but as the years went on, certainly a couple of years after I was diagnosed, I attempted suicide because I was living in a very dark place at the time, and it was not a cry for help. I took some very dangerous pills, prescribed pills, and lost several days in A&E, and then was transferred to the Maudsley Hospital, where I spent best part of a year. Since then, I've had ECT treatment, which is generally known as electric shock treatment to people, and various other CBT therapies. But 4.5 years ago, I met a psychotherapist who's been working with me on something called schema therapy, which is really kind of going back into my past and seeing where my defects may have been born into me, as it were, if that makes sense. And but in general, I found as a man with depression, and admitting to depression is a very difficult thing to do. You're instantly judged. I would say more judged sort of badly, as it were, than somebody saying, "Oh, that's a shame, I hope you get better." So I don't know if that's an experience for women as well, but certainly as a man, I found it very difficult to confess it to anybody, and also to even really be accepted within my family that I suffer with chronic depression.
So many questions, but maybe if I could just start with the ECT and the cognitive behavioural therapy treatments, and then you talked about your schema treatment. What's worked for you?
Well, the treatment, the therapy that I've been on for the last 4.5 years I'm very, very lucky because I met I met a psychotherapist through the NHS when I was re-referred, because I've gone in and out of the system, and then when I've had a relapse into depression, sometimes I've been able to cope with it just on the medication. I take 20 milligrams of citalopram, but sometimes it just goes down so bad that I go back into thoughts of self-harm. And around about 5.5 years ago, it got really bad again, so I was re-referred. And through that referral process, I met my current psychotherapist, who assessed me. It was many, many, many questions, and because I had very specific issues, a lot of them to do with my body image, a lot of them to do with social isolation, etc., etc. So the schema therapies work with me because I've been able to go on to specifics, going back to my school days, in fact, when I was a bit of a kind of, if you like, a Billy No Mates, but it was not through choice. It's just that I didn't feel as though I could interact with other kids. And then as I become a teenager, the same with teenagers. And then as I become an adult with adults, I don't socialize very well. So that therapy has helped me have to face those things. And part of the therapy process is to actually challenge myself and put myself through situations that are not very comfortable, but to experience them and then come back and then review them with my therapist. I also heard mindfulness mentioned earlier, which my current therapist referred me to, and it is a sensational treatment, and it needs to be spoken about more.
Mindfulness. Who can elaborate on that for me? Michael Dunn?
Yeah, well, mindfulness is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Anyway, is recommended in the UK by NICE as a treatment for depression, and it shows good results. It's really about when people do mindfulness, what they usually do is they focus on their breathing, and it stops the thinking process. The idea is really to kind of break the thinking process, and the thinking process in depression is one of kind of chronic rumination on the same problems. So you go over and over and over the same situation, and you maybe try and think yourself out of the situation, but it's often unsuccessful. That's a common description of what happens for many people in depression, and I suppose mindfulness can do something to address that.
Before we return to you and your experiences and expertise as a psychotherapist, I want to introduce Tim Lott into the conversation. You've written extensively about your own experiences of depression. Having heard from Tim Roberts there, were there any similarities, or would you be able to sort of tell us your journey through depression?
Well, I haven't had electric shock therapy. My experience of depression, I don't know how old Tim is, but mine also stretches back now nearly 30 years, my first episode. Though I think I was probably always depressed on some level as a child. Yeah. I wasn't particularly... I just didn't feel quite right, you know. I didn't feel what I suspected other people were feeling. There was a sort of melancholy about me, which it didn't really become identified in my mind as depression till I was that 30, when it was very serious, and I had 4 years of depression, which at that time, we're talking the 80s, was still not really spoken about, and certainly I didn't identify it as depression, and I was very reluctant to admit to myself that I suffered a mental illness. I mean, I still am, actually, but I don't find it easy, because it was stigmatic then, and it remains stigmatic now, although it shouldn't be. But since then, I've spent, as a writer, and as a person, and I was suicidally depressed, and recovered as a result of taking antidepressant drugs, which I've been on and off over the last 20, 30 years. So I had it very severely. I never attempted suicide, but I certainly went through a long period when I wanted to die. I think depression is still a mystery. You know, it's not something we can easily pin down. All these things help some people. Drugs help some people, though. Some people they make worse, and some people they leave the same. Psychotherapy helps some people. Mindfulness helps some people. So it's a very strange phenomenon. It's not like it's often described as, oh, you know, it's an illness. Well, it is, but it isn't as well. You know, it's also to do with the way you think about the world. You know, and the way you think about the world somehow is reflected in your body, and the way your body is reflected in the way you think, and it's a complicated equation. It's not simple, you know, and you know, I don't think I'll ever be able to explain it. But I recognised Mike's explanation of overthinking. I think that's a very strong part. Certainly, it's very almost a product of our heady society. You know, we're very over-intellectualised, and certainly I was at university at the time, and I was almost entirely lost in sort of reasoning and rationalisation and trying to work it out and trying to solve the problem, which was all leading me to madness. You know, and at the end of it, I was brilliantly rational. I mean, I got a job as editor of a major magazine when I was at the worst moment because I was so rational, but that rationality was what was killing me, you know, and that strength was what was killing me. Because I was very strong through all those years, and depressives are not weak people; they're very strong people whose strength turns against them, and they destroy themselves from their inability to turn around and say, you know what, I'm weak, I can't do this, you know, and that's a real barrier to their recovery.
Something
I think you know that. The other part of that is they're not as emotionally articulate as you know they would like to be necessarily, or they're emotionally inarticulate.
I was tremendously emotionally articulate. I mean, I could talk brilliantly on my emotions. You know, did me absolutely no good whatsoever.
Right. Okay.
I was extremely, you know, I've written about it for years, but I mean, even then, I was very, very good at talking about my emotions. Didn't solve the problem remotely.
Right.
In this discussion about depression, we've already had the words rational, strong, emotionally articulate. They're not words that have been used to associate with depression that I've potentially read in a lot of the media coverage of suicide and mental illness. Is there a way that you think the media should deal with depression and mental illness that would actually benefit those who suffer from it? Back to you, Tim Roberts. You talked about body image and masculinity issues. I mean, is that something that you've decided yourself that is an issue, or do you think that what you see in mainstream media or around you has some part to play in that?
I think it has some part to play in it. For my own case, I think it's something that really just came into my own head when I was a teenager. Plus, you know, the usual, because I was at an all-boys school in South East London, it was quite a tough place to be, and I wasn't quite as big as the other boys, so there was a certain amount of bullying. It wasn't a massive issue. I don't really sort of associate with my depression with being bullied at school, but it was always being said to me that I was too small, I was too skinny, etc., etc. I don't know what I was too small and too skinny for. So, yeah, there's a certain amount of conditioning there from somewhere, with somebody saying to you. And even my own dad actually was, when I was 15, was saying, well, you know, you're gonna have to start sort of growing up and getting bigger because you're going to be in the workplace in a couple of years' time. And it's a kind of tormenting thing to do to somebody. I was also, like your other Tim, quite a melancholy child. So I was always a bit different, and like I say, sort of standing on the periphery of everything at school, not really joining in things. So I think I was actually somehow magnifying myself to these people as a bit of an odd bod. And so therefore that's why maybe they bullied me or called me names or whatever. But I think recently, just in the last week, obviously, since Robin Williams died, the media reaction's been, it's a mixed bag. There's been some absolutely brilliant pieces, particularly one in The Guardian last week I read. But immediately there was an outpouring of sympathy on social networking, etc., etc. But then the day after, saw his daughter having to remove her Twitter account because people were sending sick messages to her. There was a piece in the Daily Mail last week which was followed by comments saying, well, what did he have to be depressed about? He's a film star, he's got a family, etc., etc. Like these things will change that. So I put a tweet out the other day which has just expressed my feelings about this, in that you would say, wake up as a chronic depressive on Wednesday morning, you would go out, play the lotto, win the lotto Wednesday night, but Thursday morning you'd be a millionaire, but you'd still be a chronic depressive, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And actually I want to pick up on the point that you made earlier about when you attempted suicide and it was called this cry for help.
Yeah.
And again, it's sort of going on to sort of looking at the responses, the negative responses towards that very high-profile death of Robin Williams, and that people said, what on earth has he got to be depressed about? This sort of kind of trivialisation of depression, is that one of the barriers, you'd say, I'll address the other members of the panel here, in people actually getting it right or really understanding it? Because
Well, I mean, I think there's a huge misunderstanding between in all sectors, even in, I think, mental health professionals to some extent, but less so, much less so, between unhappiness and depression. I mean, they are very different things, though they are linked, and of people, of course, who say, well, what's he got to be depressed about, are talking about unhappiness. They're saying, what have you got to be unhappy about, which is a completely different thing. Depression doesn't feel like unhappiness. No. Depression isn't like unhappiness. It's a very different feeling, and depression is like being dead. It's not, but walking around. It's not like being unhappy. I take unhappiness quite. I mean, I'm unhappiness is a normal, natural, everyday emotion for anybody. Anybody feels unhappy, or miserable, or offended, or hurt, or these are the stuff of daily life. Depression is nothing like any of that. Depression is death, but walking around. And that's the ultimate mental torment, because you walk and talk, and people look at you and they think you're normal, and inside you're just a zombie. And you can't accept love, you can't give love, you don't care about yourself, you don't care about anybody else. You're utterly selfish. Because you can't, you're trying to survive on some level. So it's invisible. It's all invisible. So it's a very horrible thing in that sense, and I can't express to anybody the mental torment of it, because it's not even suffering. It's beyond suffering. As I say, it's death. I wanted to ask the other Tim something, and I thought one of the things I wanted to put into this equation is one of the things I suffered for many years, many more years than I should have suffered from, because I was sort of traumatised by the idea of treatment, and even taking drugs for it really put me off, and put me off for a long time. So I wanted to say, for God's sake, if you're depressed, try medication. Really, what have you got to lose? I know quite a lot of people who are depressed or have suffered depression. You won't touch drugs because they think, this is me, I can beat it. They're so misguided, and you've really got nothing to lose by having a go. It might not work, but really have a go. And the thing I wanted to ask Tim is his experience of electric shock treatment, because we've all got a very negative image of that from watching things like Mum Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
I don't actually know whether it works or not, but I understand it can work quite well. And I'm in the business here of trying to knock down a few taboos. So I wonder if Tim has got anything to say about that.
Yeah, well, it was a last resort, because I was an inpatient at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, and I had gone through various CBT treatments. I was constantly self-harming. They'd had me on all sorts of medication, and then it got to the point well, every time I was going back into the community, I was a danger to myself. So they offered me ECT treatment, and strange you say that, because my first image was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was in fact. For me, I mean, you go into a ward, you're put to sleep, and they do it to you, and you go back to the ward, and you wake up and you're a bit drowsy. I had 2 a week for 6 weeks, so I had 12 treatments altogether. For me, it didn't work, but from the point of view of the doctors advising it, looking back, I can see why, because I was becoming a frustrating case for them, to be honest. Whereas they hadn't quite diagnosed me correctly at the time either. I don't really think they knew what to do with me. But there are people that it's worked for. I met people on the ward that it's made a lot better, and so.
Well, and are there any ill effects of it?
There was, for me, short-term memory loss. That's probably the worst one. It got to the point where I would bump into people, because I lived around the area where the Maudsley is situated at the time. I lived around sort of East Dulwich, Peckham, Camberwell, and there's people that I grew up with, and somebody would come up to me and say, "Hi Tim, how you doing?" It would take a little while for it to register who that was. I was told that the amount of treatments I had was quite an intense amount of treatments, like 2 a week for 6 weeks. So whether that had
But that passed, though, presumably.
Sorry?
That passed.
Yes, that did pass. Yeah, it took a while to pass it, and it did make me feel slightly. I don't know. I probably hate this word, but it did make me feel slightly out of it. It's not zombified for a little while, but yes, it did pass.
Did you regret having that treatment?
I regret having it now. I regret the process that. Because now I'm with such a great psychotherapist, and when I moved across London, because this is another thing as well, is that treatment is quite inconsistent, and I moved across to northwest London, so therefore everything had to be transferred over. But I was quite lucky, because I met quite a young psychiatrist from Italy on the NHS, and he had different methods, and one of the first things he said to me, he was being careful, but he did say to me, "There's no way I'd have given you ECT treatment. It would have been straight into, sort of deep kind of therapy, a therapeutic, a talking therapy on top of the medication."
I mean, you're very unusual,
Michael.
Tim, aren't you? Because these kinds of therapies aren't readily available for most people on the NHS. I mean, that's the thing, and I mean,
absolutely.
And I think going back to the whole business of stigma, it's very difficult for men generally to go to the doctors anyway.
Yes.
But to go with something that's a kind of psychological difficulty, or I think often people don't know what's wrong with them. They don't know what they've got. They don't know that they're ill, or they just feel different, or melancholic, as both the Tims have said. And then the media don't help, with stories about some of the headlines. I mean, Frank Bruno was a particularly graphic one, where he was humiliated and vilified, really. And he was somebody who kind of experienced manic depression. Paparazzi waiting for him outside of the inpatient unit that he was in. And then all those stories about, obviously seriously ill people standing behind you on the tube and pushing you onto the tracks, all of these sort of scare stories. When actually it's people with mental illness who are kind of on the receiving end of...
They're the ones that are scared.
That's right, yeah. They're the ones that are
Absolutely.
scared, yeah. They're on the receiving end of kind of violence and humiliation by others,
I've taken drugs on and off for many years. I've never had any side effects whatsoever. So it just made me feel better. So there's no bad effects whatsoever.
That's the same for me as well.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. But as Tim said, they don't work for some people. Some people find it difficult, I think, to get onto them. I think some of the patients I've had have combined being in therapy with me with taking antidepressants, and what I often see is that they're really helpful in the first instance, and certainly they help them to continue to come to the therapy. There's usually a point at which almost at which the sort of self gets kind of past them or underneath them, and things feel normal again after you've been on them for quite. Things feel as they were.
They can be quite hard to get off.
Yeah, and then they become difficult to get off.
I'm not. I mean, I've tried to come off them. I'm off them now, but I mean, my last attempt to come off them, I became extraordinarily bad-tempered for a long. I had to go back on them again because I was so irritable. And I mean, having said they don't have any side effects, they are quite tricky to wean yourself off. You've got to be quite careful and do it very slowly.
Yeah, there's really, really good information on the Royal College of Psychiatry website about coming off antidepressants. There's a fantastic...
Well, they're still kind of sold as being, you can come off them no problem.
Yeah, that's not the case at all.
It's quite difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with someone, and he's planning to come off his, sometime next year, and we're talking about it now, preparing for that.
Yes.
Go on, Tim. Did you want to say
I was
something?
going to say, because I came off citalopram a couple of years ago, and I just decided to take myself off of them, and I started getting quite serious palpitations and all sorts of things going on in my head. But there was, because I was really sort of, I'm just going to be brave about this now. I'm going to take myself off them. I've been on them long enough, and just went to immediate nothing, rather than where I have come off of them in a controlled situation, which is say I'm on 12 milligrams now, go down to say 10, and then cut the 10 in half, cut the half in half, etc., etc. So over several weeks, really, probably about 6 weeks.
And that's a common feature of people with the whole range of mental illness when they're on antipsychotics or medication for bipolar. Often when people feel better, they kind of just want to come off the medication. They don't see a reason for taking it, and they forget almost what it was like, and they can come off the medication. And often when people get unwell, the first question a psychiatrist will have is, are you taking your medication? And that's why people end up back on.
Can I ask you a question about that, Mike?
Yeah.
I mean, the vexed question for me was, should I bother? And I just kind of, there's not really a rational reason for me wanting to come off medication in some ways, because they don't cause me any problems. I just don't want to feel that my entire life I'm being essentially that I'm on a psychotropic drug of some kind. There's no rational reason. But what I was going to ask you is, am I in some sense misguided? Should I not worry about it? Just say, well, fine, they don't do any harm, so I'll just keep popping them. It's sort of almost a matter of, I think the other Tim will probably acknowledge there's a certain personal pride in it, of getting off them. But I don't know if there's any rational reason.
So it's a question to yourself, really, isn't it?
Well, I think if you're asking about should you come off your medication, it's actually a question to your doctor. In a way, but if somebody I was working with was taking medication and they wanted to come off them, then I would spend time with people thinking about that, in quite a kind of considered way, and I think everybody's different. So,
but what I'm trying to get at is, to take an obvious example, I know I'm completely fine. I'm off medication. I feel great, but I am also aware, or I imagine, that I'm vulnerable. That I can take some kind of blow. Yeah. Could trigger me. So that whereas it works as a sort of prophylactic, perhaps. In other circumstances. I
think all of the statistics show that people who do come off their medication can experience another episode within certain amounts of time. And this is one of the reasons mindfulness is being recommended as a treatment, is because it stands up well there, because it's an ongoing. The idea is that you make an ongoing daily commitment to it, really for the rest of your life.
Yes.
I'm not certain I would want to say whether whether people should take antidepressants for the rest of their lives, but I suppose if you feel that it's until you come off them, you don't know, do you, whether they're supporting you? Whether they're helping you, really.
Well, and you may not know for some time, as I say, because something can hit you.
Yeah.
And you can find yourself in a place. And at least you know it's a place where you didn't know it was a place once, you know. But
Yeah.
I mean, but then I guess you can always go back on them again.
Yeah.
Tim, I could hear you almost wanting to interrupt, but we are approaching the end of the discussion. One thing that has been interesting is obviously all the men here have found it very easy to talk to one another about depression, anxiety, suicide, and Tim Lott mentioned earlier about wanting to sort of knock down some taboos. Tim Roberts, just a final word from you, and then I'll get a final word from these guys here.
Yeah.
Which taboo would you want to knock down, and what would you say, having gone through various treatments, you know, sort of what could you offer in terms of advice that would make more men perhaps talk about mental health?
Wow, which taboos? There's so many. Well, from my perspective, I would like to see, say, the first point of contact is a GP surgery. I'd like to see leaflets, pamphlets, posters that are inviting men who may be suffering depression to come in to see the doctor. I find that many of the GP surgeries I've been in are not very male friendly, and so that's the first thing. There needs to be more. There needs to be more publicity. Say another male illness, cancer. Once a year, men grow a moustache in November. So even that male issue is kind of is in the background compared to other health issues. So maybe it's going to take somebody in the public eye, and there are a few people, to come out and talk about depression more regularly. I'm really stuck on that question because it's there are so many taboos. I think a man should be able to go to see his employer and discuss his situation, say like he's feeling depressed or he's been diagnosed as depressed, and not have that used against him, which it's been used against me in the past. It just needs to be. I really, really hate to say this, but I think you get me somewhere. It almost needs to become trendy, but I really hate saying that. It's just that there's certain things people openly talk about on social networking, in the newspaper. Somebody's got an addiction. There's almost something cool about that. There's not at all. But in terms of the media and the general public, that's not looked down upon as much as depression. It's a big job to sort it out.
That was a big question, but your answers were perfect. Thank you very much, Tim Roberts. I'm going to move now to Tim Lott to say you wanted to knock down some taboos, but you could almost answer what Tim Roberts was saying there about depression becoming trendy.
Well, yeah, oddly enough, bipolar depression kind of is. You know, a lot of people who are bipolar are quite open about it, and it's quite, you know, from ever since Stephen Fry talked about being bipolar, there's loads of people who kind of, I can't think of their names, but it became quite a thing to be bipolar. Possibly in the way because it's as I understand it, much more medical, much more obviously medicalised disease. It's much closer to being a disease, you know, than depression, which is much more, you know, blurred lines and difficult areas. What I just think, you know, I come back to my point earlier. I don't know if this is on the element of taboo. It's on the issue of understanding, and that is that people understand the pathology of depression. In other words, they need to understand the difference between depression and unhappiness. And this is, to me, as they're very different things. And, you know, depression has a pathology like not interrupted sleep patterns and appetite and things like, you know, self-blame and so forth. There's a whole sort of set of symptoms that will quite relatively easily be able to identify whether you're suffering depression or not. And because you can be very, very, very unhappy without being depressed. You know, so it's quite a separate phenomenon. You know, and I think people will just say, "Oh, I've got, somebody's died. Of course I'm unhappy." Because depression and unhappiness are used interchangeably, quite wrongly. But people go, "Well, of course I'm unhappy. This has happened, and that's happened." And of course, unhappiness is part of life, and you can't escape it. But you need to. It's very important that people understand when it flips into this kind of pathological state where you can't get better on your own. When good things will happen to you, as Tim said about winning the pools, it will make no difference whatsoever. When good things happen to you, you are unresponsive. There's no escape from that. You're in a prison that you made. I'd also recommend anybody reads Depression, The Way Out of Your Prison by Dorothy Rowe, which is, I think, the best book I've ever read on depression. And it's still very little known, but it's a superb book about how you get into the mental trap of depression.
I'm going to finally end with you, Michael, and just maybe, what would you like to see change?
Well, I think that the main thing that needs to change is there needs to be a much broader range of treatments for people who go to the GP, and with these kinds of symptoms of depression, there needs to be a much broader range of therapies, and as I said, Tim's been really lucky, and I'm glad to hear that, in that he's found a therapist who he can work with, who works in quite a different way, and as I understand it, he's been working with him for a number of years, but that's so unusual in the NHS. Most people get not much more than 6 or 8 sessions of CBT. Which is helpful for some people, but not most. So I'd just like to see a much broader range of psychological treatments available for people.
That was Michael Dunn, a psychotherapist based in London. And I'd like to thank all my guests: Tim Lott, novelist who's written extensively about his experiences of depression, and Tim Roberts, who is a current patient within the mental health system and has experienced chronic depression for 20 years. Thanks to all my guests.